Musicians struck up ragged chords on guitars missing strings. Vendors shouted their prices with voices sharpened by years, and children squealed as pigeons scattered before them in a whirl of gray wings. The plaza belonged to noise. The fountain in the center gurgled with the indifference of old stone. Tourists drifted, snapping photographs, while locals hurried along the edges, carrying bags that tugged their shoulders down. It was a place that thrived on distraction, a space too loud for silence. At the far edge, beneath the awning of a shuttered shop, a street artist sat cross-legged, with a battered easel propped before him. Around him, a scattering of small canvases leaned against the wall, portraits of strangers, caught in fleeting expressions, landscapes that hinted at memory more than geography, sketches half finished. Because the world rarely waited long enough for completion. His clothes bore the stains of colors he hadn't yet used, his hands trembling slightly as he mixed paint in a tin palette. Few people noticed him at first. Those who did lingered briefly, curious but cautious, before drifting back to the livelier noise of the square. The artist didn't seem to mind. His brush moved with a rhythm that was its own kind of music, each stroke a heartbeat no one else could hear. He paused only to wipe sweat from his brow, though the day was cool, or to rub his thumb across the edge of a canvas as if reassuring himself it was still there. And then he looked up and saw him. The tomb guard walked, as he always did, upright, measured, as though even the uneven stones of the plaza recognized his stride and adjusted beneath him. He wore no uniform, only a plain coat, but there was no mistaking the discipline in the way he carried himself. People turned their heads as he passed, sensing without knowing why that he was different from the crowd. He carried silence with him like a cloak. The guard stopped near the artist's corner. He did not speak. He studied the canvases leaning against the wall, the faces, the colors, the fragments of lives rendered in strokes both bold and hesitant. Then, with the same deliberate calm he used when stepping onto sacred ground, he lowered himself and sat beside the artist. The square seemed to falter. Conversations thinned. A vendor stopped mid-shout. The guitarist plucked a chord and then let it hang unresolved. No one could remember ever seeing one of the tomb guards sit, except at the tomb itself, and never among ordinary people in the noise of a plaza. The artist's brush stilled. His hand hovered above the canvas, paint dripping from its tip. He glanced sideways, uncertain whether this was interruption or invitation. The guard met his eyes briefly, calm, steady, respectful, then turned back to the canvas. It was permission without words, a gesture that said, "Continue." So the artist did. Slowly at first, then with growing assurance, he moved the brush again. The guard watched in silence, his presence like a weight anchoring the air. Passers-by began to gather, curiosity tugging them closer. Children clung to their mothers' skirts. Tourists lifted cameras but hesitated, sensing that this was not a spectacle to be consumed carelessly. The artist felt it most. He had painted before for coins dropped in a hat, for quick applause, for the restless attention of strangers. But this was different. With the guard sitting beside him, watching not with judgment but with reverence, his strokes grew more certain. His hand trembled less. The canvas seemed to open like a window, and through it, something larger began to look back. Time stretched. The plaza had adjusted itself. The fountain still gurgled, but softer. The vendors' shouts lowered into conversation. Even the pigeons circled at a distance, as though the space around the easel had become sacred ground. A woman in the crowd whispered, "Why is he here?" Another answered, "Because something needs to be remembered." The artist mixed darker tones, his brush diving and lifting like a bird testing air. He forgot the crowd. He forgot his hunger, his debts, his failures. All he knew was the presence at his side, a man whose silence was not emptiness, but witness. The guard sat unmoving, yet he was not still in the way of statues. His stillness breathed, pulsed, offered strength. His eyes followed every line the brush carved, not critically but faithfully, as though the act of watching was its own kind of creation. At one point, the artist paused to stretch his aching fingers. The guard reached out, not to correct, not to guide, but to steady the easel as a breeze tugged at it. The gesture was simple, almost invisible. Yet the crowd exhaled collectively, as though they had just seen a soldier place his hand on the shoulder of an old comrade. The artist looked at him again, lips parting as if to speak, but no words came. None were needed. The guard inclined his head once, and the brush returned to work. As the sun edged lower, shadows lengthened across the plaza. The crowd had thickened into a semicircle, silent except for the occasional rustle of coats or the soft cough of someone who had forgotten themselves. No one left. Whatever was happening on that canvas, they understood instinctively it was worth waiting for. The artist, exhausted yet alive, lifted the brush for the final stroke of the day. He paused, looked once more at the guard, and then lowered the bristles. The mark landed with quiet finality. His hand fell to his lap. The canvas waited, unfinished yet complete in some deeper way. The crowd leaned forward, but the guard did not move. He remained seated, eyes fixed on the painting, as though seeing something no one else yet could. He whispered, "It is not mine anymore." And though the painting's full meaning was still hidden, though the reveal had not yet come, everyone watching knew they had witnessed the beginning of they had witnessed something larger than art, larger than silence, larger than a chance encounter in a noisy square. His silence deepened until the plaza itself seemed to balance on it. The artist exhaled, his chest heaved. The canvas, guarded by brush and by presence, now carried a weight that would soon stun them all. The plaza had grown into a cathedral of silence. Hundreds of strangers, drawn by curiosity and then held by reverence, stood shoulder to shoulder. The vendors had stopped calling out prices. Musicians lowered their instruments, listening to something larger than melody. Even the pigeons had settled along the fountain's rim, heads tilted as though waiting for the same revelation. The street artist sat back, brush fallen loosely between his fingers. His breath came in shallow waves, his body trembling from the effort of holding so much more than paint. Beside him, the tomb guard remained still, his posture the same as it was before, the tomb, shoulders straight, chin high, eyes fixed. Yet the air between them pulsed with something alive, something raw. The crowd leaned forward, eager yet hesitant. The canvas was angled away from them, its face known only to the artist and the sentinel who had not moved from his side. Whispers spread. "What is it? Why won't they show us?" But no one dared to break the spell with shouting or demand. The plaza had become an audience not to entertainment, but to witness. At last, the guard stood. The movement was slow, deliberate, as though he were rising not only from stone but from centuries. He reached for the easel, steadying it once more, and with both hands turned the canvas outward. Gasps broke from the crowd like a single note. Some pressed their hands to their mouths. Others clasped strangers' arms without realizing it. The painting was not a portrait of the guard, nor of the artist, nor of the bustling square around them. It was the tomb, but not the tomb as tourists saw it. Not stone and flame, not the rigid perfection of military ritual. It was the tomb as memory, as longing. The canvas glowed with strokes of muted white and shadowed blue, the eternal flame rendered not as fire, but as a heart pulsing light. Figures were faintly visible ghosts, perhaps, or silhouettes of soldiers who had no names, gathered not in ranks, but in embrace. In the foreground, a single mother knelt, her hand on the stone, her face a blur of grief and love, blended so completely they were indistinguishable. And beside her, painted with startling clarity, was a child. The child was releasing something small, an object, sketched in only a few quick strokes, yet unmistakable. A paper boat, carrying words blurred by rain, drifting into the unknown. The guard did not flinch. He stood holding the canvas high, letting the plaza absorb what had been created. The painting was not simply an image, it was a mirror, reflecting every sacrifice that had gone unseen, every quiet act of remembrance, every longing for those who had not returned. The artist buried his face in his hands. He whispered through his fingers, "It wasn't me. I only carried it out." The crowd had no applause to give. Applause would have broken it. Instead, they bowed their heads, some openly weeping, others murmuring prayers, a few simply staring as though their own lives had been painted onto that canvas. A veteran stepped forward, his limp slowing him, but not stopping him. He saluted the painting, his hand trembling. A woman followed, laying a single flower at the artist's feet. Soon others came, leaving tokens, coins, medals, photographs folded and creased from years in wallets. The ground around the easel became an altar, unplanned but undeniable. The guard lowered the painting carefully back onto its stand. He did not speak, did not explain. His silence was explanation enough. He placed one hand briefly on the artist's shoulder, a gesture that steadied him, that gave him permission to accept what he had unknowingly given. Then the guard stepped back, blending into the crowd as though he had never been there, but the plaza knew he had. The artist finally looked up, eyes red but fierce. "It belongs to all of you," he said hoarsely, "not to me." And somehow, everyone believed him. News spread quickly. Photos of the canvas appeared online within minutes, yet no photograph could capture what had happened. Reporters tried to describe it, calling it the day silence painted, but even their words stumbled under the weight of the truth. The painting itself was moved to a small gallery at first, then to a national museum, where thousands lined up not to see technique or style, but to remember. Veterans touched the frame with reverence. Families whispered names before it. Children stared, sensing without knowing that something sacred hung before them. The Prime Minister himself came quietly, days later, and stood before the canvas with bowed head. He left without speaking, but those who watched him noticed tears at the corners of his eyes. As for the guard, he returned to his post. Tourists who visited the tomb after that day swore he looked unchanged, silent, immovable, the eternal watcher. But some claimed that if you looked closely, there was a new depth in his eyes, a weight balanced by tenderness. As though he had learned, in that plaza, that silence could create as much as it protected. The artist continued to paint, but never again for coins dropped in a hat. People offered him money, commissions, contracts. He accepted some, declined most. What mattered to him was not fame, but faith, the faith that what had been revealed once could be revealed again if he held the brush with humility. The story became legend, how a tomb guard sat in silence beside a street painter and stand among the living. And sometimes, on quiet mornings, the guard would pass through the plaza. He would not stop. He would not need to. His shadow was enough to steady the artist's hand. Parents told it to children. Teachers retold it in classrooms. And whenever anyone doubted that art and silence could move a nation, they pointed to that day. The takeaway lived not in headlines, but in hearts. Remembrance does not belong only to ceremonies or to soldiers. It belongs also to brushes, to colors, to ordinary people who dare to sit in silence long enough for truth to appear. And so, generations later, people still whispered when they passed the plaza, "This is where silence painted." And if they closed their eyes, they could almost hear it, the quiet of a sentinel and the scratch of a brush, creating together something larger than both.